So welcome to the TÜSİAD Global Politics Forum webinar on the recent EU parliamentary elections. Together with Soli Özel, we are hosting two distinguished guests today, Nathalie Tocci and Leonard. Nathalie Tocci is the director of the IAI and was a special advisor to the EU High Representative Mogherini. She has made significant contributions to the European politics through her influential work. And Leonard is the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR, and he has authored several books on geopolitics and international relations, and most recently, The Age of Unpeace. As announced, we will be talking about the recent EU parliamentary elections today, which have significant political implications for Europe. As we know, as a result of these elections, French President Macron has called for snap elections. Never before has an EU election affected domestic politics to such an extent. In Germany, the AfD secured second place, outperforming every partner in Schulz's governing coalition. The Greens in Austria and Germany performed significantly. And in Italy, Prime Minister Meloni's right-wing Brothers of Italy party was far ahead of all the political parties. There are many other significant outcomes in this election that we will be discussing in this webinar. And I'm going to be asking to both Nathalie and Mark to share their insights on these two questions. First, what do you consider to be the most crucial outcome of this highly contested election? And second, what does this election politically mean for Europe? And how will these elections change Europe and the course of the European Union? We'll just go first with Mark, but I have a couple of things that I should mention. There will be a English-Turkish translation. If you just press on the interpretation button, then you'll have the simultaneous translation available. You can ask questions anytime by using the Q&A button. And that's it, I guess. So you both have 7-8 minutes for your initial remarks. And as I said, we'll start with Leonard, and then Nathalie Tocci is going to be the next. Please go ahead. Floor is yours, Mark.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I'm going to sort of split the remarks into three kind of chunks. First, to look at what happens at an EU level in Brussels and how the elections change Brussels. Secondly, to look at what it means for national politics. And thirdly, to kind of look at how these two parts of European politics are going to interact with each other and make some predictions to answer your questions. So on the EU level, actually, in spite of all the Sturm und Drang that we've been having around the EU elections, the results have been quite a lot better than many people expected. We built a model to try and predict the elections at the beginning of the year, and we published it. And that kind of predicted that the far right would come top in 8 countries. They come second or third in another 8 countries, that there would be a sharp right turn in terms of the representation within the EU with a kind of hard right majority displacing the slight centre-left majority that you have at the moment. And that it was even possible that the two far-right groups, the ID and the ECR, together would be bigger than the EPP. And if you look at the results, it's not quite as bad as that. The far-right did come first in 5 countries and second in 4 countries, but that wasn't as bad as we thought. There has been a kind of shift away from a centre-left to a centre-right majority, which will have implications for policy, which we'll talk about later. But the EPP, the main kind of Christian Democrat group, with 186 seats, is still comfortably larger than the ID and the ECR combined. The socialist group, which many people thought was going to take a real drubbing in the elections, hasn't really collapsed. It's more or less stayed where it was before the elections, because there's been a sort of strong showing by socialists and social democrats in France and Italy and Spain, which to some degree offset the losses which they made in Germany. And if you kind of think about what's going to happen in terms of the leadership of the EU, the big fear was that the mainstream parties would lose their majority in the EU. But if you take the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats and the Liberals, the Renew group, the three of them together have got 450 seats, which is about 62% of the vote. It's less than they used to have in the kind of distant past, but it's not kind of dramatically worse than it was before the elections. And on paper, at least, those three groups should be able to carve up all of the kind of top jobs amongst themselves. And, if they run into some trouble, they can also expect to have help from the Greens with 53 seats, and maybe even Nathalie will tell us more about that. But there are some hopes that Meloni might be part of a kind of mainstream majority. So therefore, it's not really a kind of right-wing revolution at a kind of macro European level. It's not even much of a revolt compared to where we were before. It's a small drift in a direction which the EU was kind of looking in anyway. However, if you do look at it from the bottom up rather than the top down, the things are much less good. And what you can see is that these elections are a symptom of a kind of rot right at the heart of the EU. And most people tell us that EP elections are not really about Europe. They're second-order national elections. And the kind of real worries that people have are particularly in the two most powerful countries in Europe, France and Germany. And these elections, are very worrying in terms of the future of French and German politics. And it's quite interesting that the two countries are reacting in exactly kind of archetypally different ways. So in France, Macron, saw himself totally humiliated, getting less than half the votes that the Rassemblement National got in the elections. His reaction has been to not be a kind of frog that's being boiled in the water, but to try and jump out of the pot and regain control of the narrative by calling this election. He's sort of hoping that, he can change the story as a result of that, either by blackmailing the kind of Rassemblement National supporters to come out and vote for him again. But this is a trick which he's pulled off quite a few too many times. So the levels of interest in that are kind of sort of frustrating. The levels of support for that kind of move are not as great as they were before. Or to lose to Le Pen and to then force the Rassemblement National to be part of the government. It is a very risky thing to do, but actually it could have a positive impact in two ways. One way might be that you could return to kind of normal politics, because we've seen post the elections, the left coming together and re-emerging from their kind of death, Lazarus-like, they came back to life. And now this morning, there's talk about the far right and the right kind of forming a kind of joint group together as well, Les Républicains and the Rassemblement National. And if that happened, you would see a kind of reconstitution of French politics into three camps again, a left, a right, and a centre. So it could be a kind of normality. But also, if you did have cohabitation, it might be the best way potentially of killing Le Pen, because part of the problem is people hate both Macron and Le Pen, and this would be a kind of way of allowing a kind of change candidate to emerge that wasn't Le Pen in the next election, a post-Macron future. So it's not totally predictable. The Germans, unfortunately, are probably going to go in almost the opposite direction. All the three parties in the coalition are kind of fighting for survival, but none of them have got a particular idea of where to go forward. If you're looking at the kind of post-mortem afterwards, there's this wonderful word that the SPD is using to explain why they lost, and it's Kontaktschande, the shame of having contact with these other parties. So the dynamics of the coalition are what has basically turned off all of their supporters, that they're kind of somehow being guilty of association with the unpopular policies of the other parties. So none of them really have got a solution to get out of that. And it means that what you'll have is a lot of infighting within the parties and within the coalition, which will make Germany even more kind of dysfunctional in the future. So anyway, we could talk more about that. There are some good news stories in other countries, but the Franco-German story, I think, is the most kind of worrying. So if you think about what that means for the future of Europe, how these two levels interact with each other, I think in terms of EU leadership, the numbers are there to have the kind of package that most people thought was going to happen anyway, with von der Leyen as next president of the Commission, maybe Costa as the president of the Council, Kallas as a new HRVP. But the big wild card is what Macron does. If he manages to somehow win the elections and stop Le Pen from winning in France, he might then want to follow it up with some kind of grand gesture on the European stage. And, you know, the Hungarians would certainly be with him if he wanted to block von der Leyen. So there could be other things. So I think there's a big question about what Macron will be doing. The second thing that comes out of this, I think, is the impact on EU legislation. We're going to see a backlash on green issues, on migration, and the cordon sanitaire, which prevented cooperation between the hard right and the far right, I think was fraying before the elections, but now is going to get kind of blown out of the water. And but the biggest worry is just the kind of inward-looking and dysfunctional nature of national politics is going to make it very hard to have European unity on the big issues. If Trump is elected, for example, and Europeans are trying to come up with a common approach towards that, it's difficult to see a huge amount of leadership coming out of Germany. And if Macron is having to share the stage with Le Pen or Bardella at home, he'd be even kind of less able to reach out to people in other players. So I fear that the biggest thing is not so much what happened in the elections, but what it tells us about the weakness of national political elites in the biggest countries of the EU, which will have negative consequences for the future.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Nathalie.
Thank you. First, let me start off by saying I agree actually with everything that Mark has said. So perhaps just to add to the France-Germany bit. Well, firstly, I agree that the big story is that this is not a story at EU level. It's a story at national level in the two largest member states of the European Union. In other European countries, actually, the far right underperformed relative to expectations. In fact, the reason why, despite the very strong showing in France and Germany, in terms of overall number of seats, there's only a marginal positive net effect, is precisely because actually in other countries, I think about Poland, I actually think about Italy as well. And this is something that is forgotten. In the 2019 elections, Matteo Salvini's League, which is another far-right party, had got almost 36% of the vote. Yeah. So yes, of course, Meloni did well at almost 29, but in terms of the number of seats that Italy is contributing to far-right groups, it's -9. So, you know, I think if you kind of put various kind of, you know, there are some, in a sense, negatives there, which means that, yes, indeed, the overall result is a net positive for the far right, but this is largely because of the size of France and Germany. Now, of course, France and Germany are massive problems. I would actually think, and I'd like to hear perhaps, Mark, what you think about this. You know, of course, there have been very different reactions, but you know, to me, the French story, not just in the short term, which is obvious, but also in the medium to long term, is a more worrying story, in the sense that what you've seen in Germany over the years is that there's been a, you know, sort of the support for the AfD has kind of, you know, sort of risen at times and then it's fallen at times, you know, sort of in the years after, you know, in the context of the Eurozone crisis, it had gone up to 18, 19%, then it went back down, then it went back up, reaching 22% in the polls, and now back, you know, now it's actually on a downward curve. You know, had these elections taken place a couple of months ago, it would have been a lot worse. So there is somehow a how can I put it? A connection between policy and politics, which in Germany still seems to be working. I mean, Germany, as we know, is the country that has been most badly hit by, the nexus of Russia and China. And, I mean, there's an entire model that is being questioned. So in a sense, it's not that surprising, right, that this is happening. So I see more capacity for self-healing, in a sense, in Germany than I see in France. So, anyway, that just to put that one to the side. But first big story is this is the problem area is at national level, not so much at national level in 2 member states, rather than at broader European level. Perhaps I'll say a couple of words about Italy, and because then this allows me to get into, so what does this mean in terms of the politics and then the policy at EU level? Italy, basically, Meloni has been, sort of depicted over the last few months as the kingmaker, the queenmaker, however you want to put it. And she has done so essentially because she has managed to fool quite a lot of people in other European capitals and in Brussels. So she has managed to portray herself as a moderate when she's outside Italy. And of course, everyone inside Italy knows perfectly well there's nothing moderate about her. But she's managed to do this kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde game. Now, it seems that, but, I mean, she will obviously try and stretch this as much as possible, but that the moment of reckoning is coming, yeah? Because at some point, you need to kind of choose one way or the other, right? I mean, you need to, do you vote for von der Leyen? Do you not vote for von der Leyen? I mean, how is your group going to behave in the European Parliament? I suspect that the direction that she's headed is to try and continue the fudge as much as possible, possibly green-lighting von der Leyen in the European Council, but kind of encouraging her group to vote against her in the European Parliament. This is also because, and this goes back to what the broader results were, von der Leyen doesn't actually need her support, right? I mean, von der Leyen can actually get through if the Greens actually end up voting for her, and they may be more amenable to doing so now than they were last time round, because of course last time round they came out as the big winners from the election, and in a sense a sort of somewhat more uncompromising stance was, I think, product of that strength, right? Whereas now, it's either von der Leyen or another EPP candidate that is probably even less committed to the climate agenda. And although von der Leyen doesn't seem to have too many problems in turning her back to her own project, presumably there is some degree of greater commitment to that agenda compared to what alternatives could have. So it could be that the Greens, as Mark was also suggesting, actually end up voting in favor of von der Leyen, in which case the value added for Meloni to vote for von der Leyen in the European Parliament, as I said, not what she will do in the European Council, is actually not that great. And so she may be able to kind of play this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde game for a little bit longer. This kind of leads me to, I already said a number of things about, I agree with Mark's assessment. It looks like the top jobs are going to be taken by EPP, von der Leyen, Costa, or another socialist. At the moment, Costa seems to be the front runner, and a liberal like Kaja Kallas. Perhaps a final set of words on what this means in terms of the policies. So it seems to me that the policy priorities for the EU in the months and years ahead are going to be determined by, and they already are determined by, the external context. The fact that there's going to be focus on defense/Ukraine, enlargement/Ukraine, geoeconomics/US-China is a given. the way in which the politics that we're talking about impacts this is not in terms of what the priorities are going to be, but how they're going to be tackled. So to give some obvious examples, defense, yes, obviously this is going to be a big priority. It already is, yeah? So you're going to see more emphasis on defense, more spending on defense. However, in this even marginally, quote unquote, more right-leaning EU, it is less likely that we're going to see very ambitious defense projects at EU level, yeah? I mean, the ideas for a 100 billion fund on defense, well, perhaps slightly less likely now than they were, a couple of months ago. It doesn't take a big right-wing surge to make something difficult even harder, right? Likewise, on the question of, in a sense, geoeconomics, you can imagine, this is going to be an issue, but in a more right-leaning EU, it'd probably take the form of perhaps more protectionism, full stop, as opposed to ambitious EU policies, including, industrial policy, deepening of the single market, capitals union, and so forth. Enlargement, again, it's probably going to be a priority anyhow. But one thing is pursuing enlargement only, quote unquote, with a geopolitical security rationale, and another is wanting to use this as an opportunity to double down on reform, both in terms of reforms in the candidate countries and reforms within the EU itself, on issues like, decision making as opposed to agricultural reform. I guess my bottom line in all this is that the picture that is emerging from this, which is, as Mark was also saying, at EU level, not as catastrophic as many feared, given the catastrophically bad external context, means that the priorities that are imposed on the EU by that context will be tackled probably in a vastly suboptimal way, in an even more suboptimal way, given these marginally bad results.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Soli?
Thank you both a lot. I will reflect on what you said and ask short questions. One, in 1990, Europe represented 28.7% of the world economy. As of last year, it represents only 14%. Does this not have any impact on why the center parties, whether of right or left, and the policies they pursued over the last 20 years, and the fact that the EU did not manage to catch up with the digital transformation of the world economy, what kind of impact did these have? Number one. Number two, you both are much more worried about France than you are about Germany. But when I look at the map, it seems like Germany never really united, right? Never really unified. I mean, you have the East-West divide as starkly as possible, looking at the colors on the map. Thirdly, and that's what drew my attention, I understand that Jordan Bardella actually met with big bosses in France prior to the elections. He is the rising star of the right-wing party now, and the protege of Marine Le Pen. Do you see any such trend? That is, are the right-wingers really getting closer to corporations that are actually fairly unhappy with the restrictions and the regulations and all that stuff in Europe, especially when in the United States there are incredible economic policies that are supporting, promoting, and subsidizing private investment?
Can I just add one question from the audience, which is very parallel to what Soli is asking? Abdullah Akgüz asked that whether this election outcome implied something more serious if combined with a potential Trump victory in terms of Western values and transatlantic alliances position.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Want to go first? I mean, either of you, maybe Mark. Let's just give a couple of minutes for Nathalie.
Okay, yeah, look, I mean, I think that it is definitely a parallel between the kind of macro picture of the West as kind of elites that are being displaced and losing status and power, and the sort of micro picture of certain groups within our countries that felt that they were a majority that are now feeling threatened and worried about their kind of status and station. And I think I think that's definitely changing the nature of our politics and is leading to a different kind of mood. So I think that is true. It's a kind of like a Russian doll of loss and displacement, and there is a kind of loss mindset which affects large chunks of the population, and that's the tenor of our election campaigns. There's very little kind of optimistic pictures of the future. There's a lot of anxiety and fear. In terms of your France and Germany thing, I'm not sure. I think on Germany. I'm pretty worried in the long term about Germany, because I think that we have, invented an electoral system for Germany after the Second World War, which makes it very difficult to reform and to change anything. And there is a political culture which means that most of the big issues facing the country are not deemed to be acceptable areas of debate. So there is a very, very narrow set of issues which political parties are allowed to kind of debate and discuss. And there is a kind of the whole idea, if you look at the far right party in Germany, it's called Alternative für Deutschland, because Merkel said there was no alternative for Germany. And that is the problem, that there is a kind of electoral system which leads to elite consensus, which is stifling, and which means that many of the issues the public care about are not allowed to be discussed. And eventually, that is going to lead things to blow up. But it's going to be quite a long time because of the electoral system. So you have a kind of bigger and bigger schism between where the population is at and where the public is at. And East Germany, it's amazing if you look at the map. As you say, you've got the AfD is in the lead in every single state in East Germany, and it's only a matter of time. And you have a kind of absurd situation where nobody will talk to them or discuss anything with either of the Linke or the AfD. It's not a sustainable system. It's only a matter of time before you get an AfD prime minister for a German land in the East, and everyone's going to freak out. The way that the elite responds to that doesn't tend to be very positive. So I'm quite worried about Germany in the kind of longer term. Macron, might fix things. I mean, he's got a very different mindset. He tries to face problems, and he might fix things in spite of himself. I don't think he's doing this to prepare the ground for a post-Macron presidency, but it's not impossible that you could change that. But it's definitely more likely, I'd be willing to bet all of my modest wealth that there will not be an AfD chancellor after the next German elections. I wouldn't be willing to bet all of my assets on the Rassemblement National not winning the next presidential elections. And on the Trump thing, I think that I think I think what we're saying at these elections is that what's worrying about them is not the elections. It's more that they're a kind of symptom of political change in different places. The European Parliament doesn't really matter that much on a lot of the issues that we're talking about. And to the extent that it does, there's a kind of there's a centrist majority on it if you want it. But I do think, and also on Trump, I think it's quite interesting that the attitudes, we've done a lot of polling over the last few years, and what you find is whereas 5 years ago there was a real fear as Steve Bannon went around Europe trying to work with far right parties, that you could see some kind of illiberal international defining that, whereas actually people are pretty hostile to Trump everywhere here. I mean, they might change their attitudes when he becomes president, but I suspect not in a positive way. So I'm not as worried about that as I was 5 years ago. I think in some ways Brexit and the kind of political changes within Europe have changed the far right parties, and Meloni in a way is a perfect illustration of that. She might be slightly Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but she's at least Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which Trump nobody could claim was trying to integrate these two sides of his personality. And from an EU perspective, Meloni is, has not been a disruptive influence particularly. She's, obviously, it's easier to be more relaxed about other countries' populace than your own. But from a kind of international perspective, she's been quite a conservative mainstream figure rather than somebody who's been overturning the apple chart, and is very different from Trump in that respect.
Well, Mark, maybe it is because you're an expat Brit living in Germany that you're so cool about it, because your co-panelist, in a widely read, I think, article said, the normalization of the right does not necessarily make it less extreme. If constraints loosen, perhaps with the return of Trump as president in November, Meloni will be more than happy to show her true face. If Trump and Orban agree to force Ukraine to surrender, she will not think twice. Woo. Can you add this to your answer?
But can I just, maybe Nathalie can tell us, because my assumption is also that the dynamics in Italian politics are all pushing her in the other direction. She's got this incredible open space in front of her, which she can fill. So, why would you become Le Pen's ally when you can actually become one of the kind of dominant players, not just in the center in Italian politics, but also within the EU? There's a lot more space there than there is sort of fighting with Salvini to become, the representative of kind of illiberal Italy. And she does seem to have a good sense for how to calibrate her messages to fill as much space as possible, which is what has been quite interesting about her performance compared to other leaders' performance over the last few years in terms of, and her ability. When we did polling in terms of how Italians looked at the Fratelli d'Italia, they don't see it as a kind of Eurosceptic party anymore, either her voters or other voters. That's very different from the way that the AfD is seen by like non-AfD supporters, or even PiS in Poland is seen by non-PiS supporters. But only 7% of Italians think that that she wants to leave the European Union, and it's exactly the same percentage of her own supporters who say that. So she has managed to do something which has detoxified her brand in a way that's quite impressive to other players. It might be that she's still a kind of fascist inside, and I can understand why Italians would be kind of nervous about that. But anyway, Nathalie will know much more than me about the kind of incentives for her. But I'd have thought that there's quite a lot to play for in terms of playing this. I think she's got a lot more space outside of the far right than in the far right.
Great. So Nathalie, as the far right, I've used the call is now aligning more with the center in a very general way. If I ask you, if I direct you to this question, but specifically, as Mark said, it's about Italian politics and Meloni as well. But feel free to answer the other questions that Soli asked, and the floor is yours.
Let me start with this. No, I am far more skeptical, Mark, than you are. I think from a domestic political perspective, she doesn't have an incentive to moderate. Let's not forget that parties before her that did, in electoral terms, far better than she did not win, 40% of the vote by playing moderate. Five Star Movement, Lega. So there is an assumption that I hear often, what you say, I've heard this before, an assumption made outside that she will have a domestic political incentive to go for the center, and I'm not sure that that's correct in Italian. I mean, that's not, at least it's not the way in which Italian politics has worked over the last decade and a half. So that's kind of one point. The second is connected to this is, yeah, that still won't mean, and here I would agree with you, that she will opt for leaving the European Union. her project is far more ambitious than this. After Brexit, no one in their right mind thinks about leaving the European Union. So it's about changing the project from within. The way in which billboards, Meloni's billboards across the country for this election had one slogan: Italy changes Europe. It is not about Italy playing the European game to extract more benefits. It's about Italy changing Europe. There's a political project there. Meloni constantly says, and actually I believe her, that she is not occupying, she is, in Italian you say, she's not warming the chair. Yeah, she's not in power for the sake of power. I think this is another assumption that tends to be made, by quote unquote, the establishment, whatever that means, yeah, is that these politicians are actually all about power. No, they're about ideas. She wants to change things. So I actually think we should take these people far more seriously than we do. Then, going to Soli's quote, of course it's going to be a matter of constraints. So far, there have been very tight constraints on her, yeah? There's been Next Generation EU money, there's been Biden sitting in the White House, she hasn't had a lot of friends sitting around the European Council, so she's not an idiot, and not being an idiot, she's obviously had to adapt herself. And so I don't think this is a black and white story. I don't think that at some point something definitive is going to happen, but it's a story of shades of grey. And so to me the question is, are those constraints loosening? And I think very clearly the answer is yes, they are loosening. There is not fresh European money coming in Italy's way. Meloni has more friends sitting around the European Council. She sees, France possibly at some point down the line. Indeed, then trillion-dollar question is what happens on the other side of the Atlantic. In that kind of scenario, she's going to be more than happy to be herself. It would pay off in domestic political terms because Italy will have changed Europe. Yeah, this is what she's standing for. This is also a country that, has a chip on its shoulder. It's a big country, never really considered as a big country. And, all of a sudden, she is able to really sort of give the cards in Europe. So, being more nationalistic does not mean that she's going to lose support at home. On the other, so anyway, I'm extremely skeptical, and I would be extremely surprised if she, simply green lights von der Leyen, green lights, and not in the council, as I said, I've got no doubt there. Green lights her, actually manages to keep ops for a cohesive ECR group by maybe kicking out others in order to be part of the majority. I mean, that's pure fantasy. She's made this very clear. Since, was it 2 nights ago, she's been constantly saying we will never be in a, part of a majority with the socialists. As I said, one needs to, I think it's a little bit like Putin, right? I mean, we need to take these people seriously. Anyway, other remarks on the question, on Soli's question of the economy. Yes, I think you're right. I mean, it's clear that there is this big structural story of a European decline. I think the paradox of this is that decline is, in a sense, inevitable and inexorable. It has to do with the kind of big sweeps of history. And the whole point is that the European Union mitigates that decline. It doesn't stop it. It can't reverse it. It mitigates it. And of course, the paradox is that what is happening is, sort of increasing the chances that the EU is going to be less and less able to mitigate that decline. So kind of, fueling further that vicious cycle. On Germany, Mark knows far more than me. I don't have much to add. But let me perhaps kind of address that final business question, Soli, that you were asking. It seems to me that at the end of the day, I mean, business business is not ideological, business is not political, business just kind of wants to do business. So in a sense, the secret, and this is not just a remark about right-wing populists in liberal democracies, it's a remark about authoritarian, authoritarian countries. The minute in which basically authoritarian countries got the trick of merging capitalism with authoritarianism, all of a sudden it's all fine, right? So, I think it's part of a bigger story. Which then indeed kind of plays out within liberal democracies themselves. So yes, I can. You've seen it happen in Italy. I mean, the business community is in love with Meloni because she's not. She's slightly tempered. Ideas sort of very strongly protectionist ideas, and in any case, protectionism is kind of a la mode. So you can be pretending. It's not as if we're living in the 1990s. So long as you don't tread, too much on their feet, they're happy to go along with anyone. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're happy to go along with, Bachelard Le Pen, so long as, they maintain a degree of kind of space for maneuver.
Thank you so much. We have many questions actually 3 questions, but very good questions from the audience. Let me start with the first question. The question is about NATO and the future of NATO. And this is somehow basically reflects what you have said in your remarks, in which you would agree that the problem is more at the local level, national level, than at the EU level. And you also would said that this is a Franco-German problem, and Mark said that this is a problem of leadership in both countries. But so given that both in terms of NATO, Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine, this leadership, this cooperation really matters. How this is going to affect the future of NATO, the future of the EU response to the Ukrainian invasion. So the first question is related to that, but we can have a broader perspective in general in responding to that as well. There are 2 other questions which are quite different. If you just respond to this NATO question and Ukraine question, then I'll be interacting the other 2 in the following round.
So I think the bigger question in terms of Ukraine is what's going to happen in Washington and in American politics. I think if Biden is re-elected, I don't think this election is going to have very much of an impact. There are challenges in terms of European unity, which we talked about, which will be slightly exacerbated by the domestic psychodrama in France and Germany. But if Biden's elected, I think we're going to see a shift in the debate on Ukraine anyway. With certainly in Washington, when we get into 2025, they are not going to, they're thinking about how do we move towards some sort of a new phase and move towards some sort of conclusion to the war. So I think people are thinking in slightly different terms in Washington anyway. The big question is what happens if Trump is elected. And there, I think Europeans are very divided about exactly what to do. They're not divided in the sense that, we basically did a lot of polling on that as well. And what we find essentially is that most Europeans are quite skeptical about Ukraine being able to win the war. Only 1 in 10 Europeans think that that's likely to happen. The majority of people think that the war's going to end with some sort of settlement. At the same time, people are not really in the mood for appeasement. So when we ask people about that Trump scenario, what they would do, whether they think we should carry on at the existing levels, increase our support to try and replace the Americans, or force Ukraine to do a deal and follow the Americans on that front. There are a plurality in every single country that we polled that wanted to in most countries. Hungary was slightly different, but almost all the countries, there was a plurality that wanted to carry on the support at the current level or increase it. But I think, that's going to be tougher with the political situation that we're in at the moment. And, you know, I think it's going to be very difficult anyway. I think this just shows how difficult it's going to be. But I do think that Europeans have tended to do better on Ukraine than anybody expected so far. I do think one of the worries is about whether Ukraine itself and European countries can sort of shift gears, because there are new threats which are coming about, and I think we need to have a better hierarchy of what our kind of worst fears are and what a good scenario is. And I think Trump, in a way, will change the debate, because he can show what the most scary thing from a European perspective is, which is not just that the peace deal that he's going to suggest will involve, you know, Ukraine losing a lot of territory, but also I think the danger is that he could try and, as part of the deal, close the door to NATO, and, you know, insist that Ukraine remain a neutral and demilitarized country. And from a European perspective, I think that would be a much bigger defeat than whatever territorial concessions, you know, get made, particularly as they won't be de jure territorial concessions. It will be a de facto situation. But I think that is the big kind of question. And on enlargement, I mean, you know, certainly the balance of power in the European Parliament has moved in a more kind of negative direction. But even on the far right, you know, you've got a kind of whole range of different issues. And there's talk today of Hungary being kicked out of the Bucharest 9, and then going down to Bucharest 8. So, you know, there are a lot of divisions on the right and the far right. You know, one of the other big questions, I mean, a lot of it does come back to Meloni. So that's one of the other things which has made it much harder for Orban in the kind of right to be in the pro-Putin camp. It's not been a cool position to adopt for a lot of different players. And Meloni has made that more uncomfortable. But what she would do, I suspect Nathalie will tell us that she'll just follow Trump if Trump is elected, because she'd certainly be going with Italian public opinion. I think that would be a big change in terms of the European dynamics.
Yeah, Nathalie, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. So yes, I mean, I agree that in the Biden scenario, it's basically what we have now. It is really the Trump scenario that is, in a sense, the second round of the European election, if that were to come about, in the sense that it really, you know, what happens would play out politically after that moment. And I think the three things to look out for are, in a sense, the question of the political divisions or unity division, the question of kind of norms and rules, and indeed the question of security and defense as it relates to Ukraine. On that first question, which actually relates to the second in many ways, you know, Trump 1.0 had that unifying effect on Europe. And it had that unifying effect on Europe because there was a sense that here was Europe led by Angela Merkel that was the leader of the free world, you know, as the US had temporarily checked out of the free world. Europe stood united, and of course, you know, there had been Brexit in the background there, but basically Europe stood united in defense of those values. The problem is, and this relates to the conversation that we were having earlier, that given that now the agenda of the nationalists has changed, and it's a hollowing out agenda, it is far more likely that a second Trump administration would have a divisive effect on Europe. And of course, this then also relates on the impact that it would have on, you know, questions of kind of, you know, democracy, rights, rule of law, etc. in Europe. So I think there's a very strong connection between the two sides of the Atlantic there. You know, I mean, I realize that I'm kind of, you know, very conditioned as an Italian, but it is crystal clear in my mind that, you know, someone like Meloni has, for frankly speaking, mainly economic reasons, needed to act as a good Western citizen. And she, people like her don't give a damn about Ukraine, frankly speaking. It is all about proving that you're a good Western citizen. And, obviously the way that Ukraine has been a function of that, yeah? Now, if you can prove to be a good Western citizen and the West, and it connects also to the point that you were making earlier about business, yeah? The West does not necessarily have to stand for liberal values, but it can stand for, other values, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's not as if pretty nasty values were not an integral part of European history, right? Or Western history for that matter. So there is nothing that prevents, basically, someone like Meloni gradually, basically, kind of morphing into a very different kind of animal if there were Trump on the other side of the Atlantic. And this could be, as I said, perfectly compatible with acting as, we the West. It's just a very different West from the one in which, we're kind of, we're used to talking about. This then, of course, relates to how this all plays out in Ukraine, which I think is actually the only real kind of foreign policy issue on which Trump would have a really significant effect in terms of the impact on Europe. I think the two big impacts have to do with European democracy, and the second has to do with security. I'm kind of less concerned about the implications of a Trump administration on the Middle East as opposed to China, not that it would not be consequential, but I see it more as a matter of degree rather than a categorical flip in terms of the impact that it would have. And there, but it relates back to this question of division. So, in a different kind of Europe, Trump turning its back to Ukraine would obviously kind of, put Ukraine in a pretty difficult position, but it could have a galvanizing effect on Europe, which of course would not be able to totally replace the United States, but maybe it would be the ultimate kick in the ass that Europe needs to kind of do more on security and defense. But with this Europe, I doubt that it would happen. And of course, that would not only have very immediate consequences on Ukraine itself. And I think Mark's absolutely right. The big question in my mind is not so much, is Ukraine going to reestablish territorial control over, the 1991 borders, but is there going to be a puppet government in Kyiv, which has always, at the end of the day, been kind of, Russia's objective. I'm not even sure that objective is preventing that objective is within reach in the kind of scenario that we're talking about. Maybe I'm just being excessively catastrophic, but I think, as I said, this kind of interplay between what happens in terms of domestic politics in the US and how it plays out firstly on domestic politics and democracy in Europe, and how that in turn plays out on foreign policy, in particular Ukraine, I think is hugely important.
As we approach the end, obviously, we need to ask you some questions about Turkey. And there are a couple of questions from the audience as well. Now, Mark identified two issues on which the EU will regress. One is the green transformation, and the other one is, of course, a much less tolerant policy towards migration. Can we say the same for enlargement? Is enlargement in trouble? And if enlargement is in trouble, Nathalie, and you have been definitely one of the most solid supporters of Turkey's accession, what does that do to the already moribund, if not dead, Turkey-EU relations? And particularly, what does it do to the migration agreement between Turkey and EU? Because there is a lot of ill feeling in this country about that particular agreement and the way I think the European Union handled it.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I don't think that this more right-leaning EU is one that necessarily turns its back on enlargement. I mean, I hinted at it earlier. I think, in a sense, a more right-leaning, more nationalistic EU is perfectly compatible with a, sorry, Mark, very British understanding of enlargement, right? I mean, you widen in order not to deepen. A geopolitical understanding of enlargement. I don't see it as being incompatible because, again, these are not people that want the EU to collapse. They just want to change it from within. It's a different project. And so a wider EU, which is basically, I don't know, not quite sure exactly what the purpose would be, but anyway, that's not incompatible with that right-wing, more nationalistic agenda. What is incompatible with it is the widen in order to deepen, or deepen in order to widen. Yeah, I mean, basically kind of looking at integration and enlargement as potentially two sides of the same coin. So what I think is out in this kind of EU that we're talking about is, for instance, moving forward on the kind of good ideas that the French and the German Europe ministers put out a year ago, right? I mean, using enlargement as a hook to move forward on reform. Not necessarily, I'm not here talking about treaty reform, but I'm just talking about reform, right? Whether this is institutional reform, decision-making reform, policy reform, say agriculture, for example. So that is out, I think, in the kind of EU that we're talking about. Turkey is, in this revival of enlargement, Turkey, in a sense, has been conveniently bracketed out, right? And I think the Turkey question probably would only come back on the agenda in enlargement terms. When at some point it will happen, there will be political change in Turkey. I think at the moment it's very conveniently bracketed out, partly for good reasons and partly, as I said, out of convenience. On the migration front, the EU-Turkey deal's the model, yeah? I mean, what has Meloni and von der Leyen been trying to do? Replicate the Turkey model with Tunisia, with Egypt, with Mauritania. So basically, it is about the EU-Turkey deal on steroids. Now, I think it'd be extremely interesting if Turkey actually were to itself move back from this, because the EU is kind of accelerating in this direction. Yeah, I mean, it wants to do EU-Turkey deals with everyone. But it would be fascinating to see what the politics would end up being like if it's Turkey that pulled the plug.
So yeah, I don't think that the relationship with Turkey has got anything to do with enlargement anymore. And I don't think it's probably going to again for a very long time, even if they're in a post-Erdogan regime. But I also don't think that the sort of classic elements of enlargement are remotely going to happen anyway in the next European Parliament, or probably the one after that. The way that we're in a kind of strange situation where, on the one hand, there's a geopolitical necessity of making sure there's a European anchor for Ukraine and Moldova. And I think people are very committed to making sure they don't get left out in some sort of buffer stateness, as a buffer state between Russia and the European Union. But at the same time, if you look at, if you go to Poland or countries which are very close to Ukraine and very supportive of it, they're totally against any attempts to integrate Ukraine any further into the EU. In fact, they want to de-enlarge and start kicking Ukraine out of the single market, make it harder for their agricultural products to come in. They're very against more money going to Ukraine, and are kind of extremely nervous. And you have farmers protesting not just in Poland, but in all sorts of other places. When it comes to institutional reforms, even before the European elections, without any change, pro-European people like the Donald Tusk party are all very against any of the institutional reforms that the French and the Germans have been promoting. And, if you go to Austria and places like that, they want to say, okay, that Ukraine and Moldova can't join the EU until after Kosovo has joined, or Bosnia, maybe even Turkey. When Turkey comes back into the picture, you'll know that this is the ultimate decision that enlargement is not going to happen at all. So I'm quite skeptical about us seeing any moves towards enlargement in classical terms. But I think the more kind of creative work is being done in terms of rethinking what enlargement can mean as a way of building resilience and building, a war economy and helping these countries whose security is very closely entwined with the EU security survive as independent and democratic states. And that, there are elements of that which are linked with enlargement, whether it's about energy security, whether it's about, but actually in many ways, Ukraine has got all of the big benefits of enlargement already without going through an accession process, and it's been unilateral. So from a Ukrainian perspective, they would start to lose things if we went down a kind of classical process of enlargement rather than gaining things. So, I'm sure there'll be big fights about starting an IGC and all those sorts of things, but I'm pretty skeptical that very much is actually going to happen. And, I don't need to talk to Turks about the difference between, moving forward procedurally and actually getting any closer to membership of the EU.
Excellent. Thank you so much there. I mean, we don't have much time left, maybe a couple of 10 minutes or more or less. There are a lot of questions coming in, and I'm going to try to combine them and then direct you some of these questions, if not all. There is a question about UK-EU relationship with regard to the cooperation on defense and other issues, as the Labour Party is overwhelmingly likely to win the general election next month, and given the current composition in the European Parliament, how the EU-UK relationship is gonna be shaped in the short term. There are also questions about democratization, Europe as promoting democracy, and now with this results, Europe is becoming more of the same. Şafak Göktürk asked in terms of protectionism, selective globalism, and also autocratizing tendencies and this and that. So how do you see the role of Europe in promoting democracy with this results? I mean, let me stop here and then I'll give you the floor. Maybe Nathalie first, right?
Okay. On EU UK, Mark's going to say probably many more interesting things than I can. But so on one level, in a sense, there's it's almost tragic, yeah, because things go, as things go wrong in the EU, things start going right in the UK, and so there's having said this, I do think that. Even if, for what I just said a second ago, that potential cooperation is not going to be maximized, or potential integration is not going to be maximized, because at least on one side of the equation there isn't, and I don't know whether Keir Starmer is entirely committed anyway, but certainly on the EU side there is. People don't have their eye basically on the ball, and so I think opportunities will be missed. But having said this, I think despite opportunities being missed on the EU side, despite Keir Starmer perhaps not being the most courageous of people, at least not to begin with. Let's see how it plays out over time. Having said this, I think that it is clear that something will happen, and it is clear that that something will be in the security and defence space, probably to begin with. So the question, I think, on the EU-UK relationship has more to do with the level of ambition, which probably is not going to be as high as it could be, given political circumstances. But I think the direction of travel is one of growing convergence and working together. On promoting democracy, obviously there's none of that left, yeah? So that would make it a very short answer. Quite slightly elaborated. I think there is a genuine question which I at least, and I don't think anyone really has come up with a really satisfactory answer to, which is, okay, we probably all agreed that we can't do democracy promotion as we once did, because that method belonged to a world that is no longer available, right? So the method of whatever, finger wagging, conditionality, up until, so economic conditionality, trade conditionality, up until bombing countries into democracy, that belonged to a different world. For better or worse, that world is no longer there. In a world in which there's competition, in which our relative power is declining, in which we have this kind of growing nationalism and illiberalism at home, those methods are no longer available. However, I think the problem is, so that's fine, okay, if we're all agreed, probably all agreed on that. The problem is that what we're doing is we're flipping from that to nothing, as if there's nothing in between. So and I don't know what that something in between could be, which is where I don't have an answer. But I think there's a genuine question about what is an alternative way of having a principled foreign policy in a world which is no longer, the unipolar liberal international order, blah, blah, blah, blah world. Yeah. So what are the methods? What are the instruments? Could we pursue? I mean, I can think of partial answers, doing more on climate, for example. But in terms of principles in the more traditional sense of the term, human rights, it's difficult to come up actually with a compelling alternative to how we used to do it. Although, as I said, the old way is no longer available.
Just very, very shortly on democracy promotion and whether or not we live in the world of the 1990s. Can EU as a collectivity and putting aside some of its members really have any credibility talking about human rights or democracy, looking at the, in my judgment, abysmal approach to the Gaza?
No, I mean, very short answers.
Okay. Mark, for your final remarks.
Great. Look, I think Nathalie did a great job. Maybe just a tiny bit more granularity on the UK question. I mean, I think, the Labour Party's been ultra cautious in the run-up to the elections, and so we'll carry on being cautious for a few more days. But it's looking like Labour Party will get a kind of decent-sized majority, and is also boxing itself in quite dramatic terms in terms of its ability to raise money by ruling out most tax rises. So therefore, there is going to be a huge pressure to find ways of delivering growth, because that's the only way that you can deal with the kind of fiscal constraints that Labour Party is going to face. And I think if it's going to survive, this government's going to need to have considerable investments in public services, because that's the main reason why people are voting Labour this time. So that will lead it to have to look at the relationship with the EU, not just in security and defence terms, but in a kind of wider perspective. The way in will be, the Labour Party said that it will try and negotiate a security and defence pact, but I think they're thinking in very wide terms about what security means, to include economic security, energy security, technological security, and all sorts of other elements which have got real impact on the single market in different areas. Labour Party has committed to some red lines. It's not going to formally join the single market, which I think is a real red line, because freedom of movement is something which is still neuralgic in a British domestic political context, and not to join the customs union. But you don't have any of the hang-ups about sovereignty, about the European Court of Justice, and about other questions which are there for the Conservative Party. The vast majority of Labour MPs and Labour voters want to rejoin the EU. There is now a kind of majority at a popular level. I don't think they're going to break their red lines, but I think that they will definitely look at ways of removing friction. So they talked about signing, deals on phytosanitary conditions. I'm sure they'll align with CBAM and various other kind of regulatory things, and we'll try and reconstitute a de facto customs union as part of this kind of wider agenda. But it's going to be complicated because, as Nathalie said, the politics on the EU side is very difficult. In some ways, Trump, were he to be elected, might end up being the midwife of a new UK-EU relationship. Because I think one of the things which you also won't have from Keir Starmer as Prime Minister is a kind of ambivalence about whether he wants to be on the European side or the American side. It's going to be very different to when Trump was there last time. And so I think both from London and from other European capitals, there'll be quite a big desire to get the UK more into kind of European security business than it has been before if Trump is elected. And that could lead to spillover into all sorts of other areas and lead to more flexibility on both sides around some of the red lines that were there when Theresa May was negotiating the initial Brexit deal. But, it's not going to be rejoining the EU, and it won't be rejoining the single market. But I think you could have a very different relationship. And certainly the instinct on the in Westminster and in Whitehall is going to be to work with the EU as closely as possible rather than to try and find difference. And that, I think, will lead to a very different kind of relationship, particularly on foreign policy and defense issues. But I think probably right across, given how important, how securitized all aspects of economic policy have become, you could see really very different situation when it comes to kind of regulations in all sorts of different areas, what happens on climate change, what happens on energy policy in other areas. So I would have thought the relationship will look quite different. And if it works, then that could prepare the ground for, a future government being even more radical, because, it's not impossible that you'll get a two-term Labour government out of this, given what a mess the Conservative Party's in at the moment. So you might have, a slightly different political constellation in 5 years' time to one now, and less red lines going into the next election.
Excellent. Any final remarks from anyone? Soli, Nathalie, Mark? No?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you very much. This was especially because you disagreed on.
Yes, I agree.
I believe the matter. This was very exciting and certainly very informative. Thank you very much for your time and energy.
Thank you, Mark, Nathalie. Thank you. Have a good day or night, depending on where you are. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Thank you so much.